Hi, welcome to our session, Increasing the Use of Evidence-Based Practices for Students with Disabilities in Middle School Mathematics Classes. I'm Kathleen Pfannenstiel, the project director, and this is my colleague,
Pakethia Harris.
So welcome. All right, we are going to jump right in. Go ahead, Pakethia.
Yes. So welcome for joining us today for this session. We just want to remind you that we will be highlighting a virtual book study that took place. And this was really to have teachers understand evidence-based practices, as well as to have them work on their increasing their engagement with students with math difficulties and also disabilities. And we're hoping that once you attend our session, that you are able to replicate some of the materials that we are going to go through, such as utilizing the math pack, instructional coherence within and across grades, to engage students in increasing their engagement, also teachers' use of multiple representations, and using higher level questions. Also, we want you to be able to take what's learned from the lessons learned from our teachers and implement those as well in order to increase evidence-based practices being utilized. So this project is called Project TIPS, Teaching Teachers Instructional Practices for Algebraic Readiness. This is an OSEP funded model demonstration project, and it's in its concluding year. And the purpose of this project, with all of the demonstration math projects, was to really increase discourse, that back and forth communication between students and teachers, as well as conceptual and algebraic understanding. And this was focused on middle school mathematics. So if we go to the next slide, and we really wanted to develop professional development modules that teachers could use in order to build in those three areas of multiple representation, sorry, a little tongue twisted right now, inquiry-based questionings, and student engagement. And if we go to the next slide, the outcomes for that is that often we know that students with math difficulties and learning disabilities specific to math have some key characteristics that make gathering the information challenging. And so we wanted to build the capacities of teachers in order to use evidence-based practices in order to address those skills and the needs for those particular students. Research has shown that engagement, getting students engaged, as well as creating lessons that are reviewed and edited in order to build not only the teacher's understanding for feedback, but also helps engage the students as well. So by doing a book study, we wanted to ensure that teachers were reflective in their lesson planning in order to hit those areas in which are the project outcomes. So let's get a little context to this. The national trends when it comes to mathematics and students with disabilities. So understanding the principal foundations of algebraic understanding is that it's really based on having a strong foundation in numeracy skills. And this is very critical for the middle school grades because often they need those skills from the elementary level in order to build up. It's a scaffolding process with math. And so having those key skills as foundational will help students as they matriculate on through high school. So as we said, building upon mathematics, it relates. It's a skill that builds upon one another, and it's just not something that's learned in isolation from grade to grade. And so as students get older, we're seeing that sometimes there are these gaps among grade levels. And so really the focus is trying to understand where those misconceptions lie in order to build in those gaps and fill in those gaps in order to address those misconceptions that students may have had in the past, and also making sure that we provide greater intentional supports and also making sure that our interventions are aligned to that. And if we move on, we'll see that the national trends have remained the same for years. And that is that students with disabilities continue to perform below that of their peers. And the gap is not shrinking. It continues to go to get further and further, grows significantly, the difference between those two. And so we want to ensure that there are being practices that are being used in order to help close that gap. And if we move to the next one, we'll see that not only in elementary, but this continues in middle school grades as well. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Kat in order to discuss some of those challenges.
Great, thanks, Pakethia. So not only do we have these gaps in understanding and mastery of skills, so now how do we meet the needs of all these students in our classroom as teachers? And I cannot just have a teacher away doing professional development all the time in order to meet those needs. And so when we look at our problems of practice, one, we have 33% of students in special ed diagnosed with a learning disability. Of that percentage, about 7% will be identified as having a math learning disability. And majority of those students are actually in general ed classrooms, meaning general ed teachers have to meet those student needs. There's not often a special educator assigned to every single teacher. As a former special educator, I was assigned to a team. So I could not be in every single classroom. And so our general ed teachers have to collaborate with special ed in order to meet those student needs, because the majority are in those core math classes. The problem is that teachers, and this is both general ed and special ed, often don't feel prepared in meeting student needs. And this is reflective in the data. As Pakethia pointed out, the scores are pretty stagnant. We're not seeing much growth for typically developing peers as well as students with disabilities. And the additional challenge that we're finding now, of course, COVID, whether we call this post-COVID, whatever land we're in right now, we know that a lot of students were not attending school regularly. Virtual classes, hybrid classes, that engagement, whether or not students were actually logged on, had their screens on, all of those pieces. But what we're finding is that skills and mastery are going to be most apparent in mathematics, meaning these were challenges that existed pre-COVID, and now they're just doubled post-COVID. And so we really need to think about, so why are students struggling in mathematics? It simply wasn't because of COVID. It's not because, oh, they were in a virtual class. They had deficits prior to COVID. So we have to really think about what specific skills are the most challenging. Is it those elementary skills, or is it those critical math skills that make those connections? Were they lacking that place value understanding, and now it's affecting ratios and proportionality? How is that going to affect their ability to understand algebra, which we know is the key to long-term success? The other big piece is that a lot of times students are coming to the middle grades with misconceptions. Thinking about an easy one, subtraction, we always start with the larger number, the bigger number. That's a misconception, because in integers, a -7 can start a subtraction sentence. And so really thinking about, what are we doing to further the misconceptions? Are we teaching rules that expire? And then thinking about our own math experiences, both as teachers as well as our students. Did they receive the same extent of math exposure? Yes, there was math in the master schedule. Yes, they're in a math class, but what was the teacher's understanding? How well did the teacher bring in those evidence-based practices? How well did the teacher teach to the conceptual understanding? And so not only that, thinking about my own teaching, what do I bring? What's my level of understanding? And that's going to impact how I teach as well as how much the students absorb. And so when we think about this, when we walk into classrooms, there's often common skill deficits for students with math difficulties. This could include working memory, number sense, symbols, whole number computation, word problem solving, vocabulary, and self-regulation. Often when people see this list, like, well, that's elementary. I mean, number sense, that should be developed. The problem is that there are gaps in that understanding that affects students in the middle school. And so you'll often find, as middle school teachers, interventionists, special educators, we often have to go back to fill in those gaps. That working memory piece, that idea of like, my brain hurts at the end of the day. Yes, it does, because those students are lacking those prerequisite skills. So everything is kind of in the lobby, meaning nothing's from long-term memory. And so how that impacts all those other areas leads to the students in that greater gap. And what they're finding is that as students progress in the grade level, the gaps just continue to widen, making it more difficult to meet the student needs. So what does this mean? What does this mean for my teaching? Well, if I'm not the teacher, but how do I support teachers? How do I support teachers as a researcher? How do I support teachers as a coach? How are we supporting our pre-service teachers? Are we teaching them so that they have that conceptual understanding that they can then teach it? Or are we just recreating the wheel and using how they taught, how they were learned, which then transverses to how they're teaching students, which leads to misconceptions and down that rabbit hole of we're not really addressing the student needs. So a lot of folks are like, well, then we'll just send them to professional development. We'll get them coaching. Well, first of all, we have a huge issue with recruitment and retainment of teachers. Not only do general ed teachers need to be attending PD, but our special educators have to. And often special ed is left out of the discussion, meaning, oh, all the math teachers are going for a new training on curriculum or math PD. They didn't think about inviting special educators. So even as researchers, as we team up and collaborate with our math research counterparts, how are we including special educators in those conversations? How are we addressing students that struggle? The other big piece is we often have limited resources, meaning rural areas. They're often hindered by not having enough resources. So they'll go to a professional development. Oh, we're going to use multiple representations. I don't have any of those tools. How do I meet those needs of students with disabilities that are in core classrooms? Because we know about 80% are, but we don't have the resources. The other big piece are the time and human resources. We often need subs. We know not only is there a teacher shortage, there's often a sub shortage. So how do I send all my math teachers, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and my special educators? I can't have that many people leave for a full day training. As a researcher, how am I providing that training so that it's not impacting the school day? Or I've left, it's a requirement of research, but now I've left the campus without teachers. So thinking through those pieces. The other big part is that evidence-based practices, in theory, we know they work. It's not even in theory. We know they work. It's an evidence-based practice, but it doesn't always transcend across settings. When we think about rural settings, if we're talking about co-teaching, they're like, there's one special educator to 3 schools. We work on a cohort kind of design. So that how do we translate those evidence-based practices that they'll work in an urban, suburban, and rural setting? And so this leads us to, well, how can we leverage our virtual? A lot of folks are getting more comfortable in the virtual space. So there is a silver lining to COVID. But one of these pieces is this virtual idea of doing PD, but not just professional development in a full day. How can we think about this in smaller chunks? So this idea of how do I bring together peers from across the country so that they're like, oh, it's just in my school. Actually, I'm facing the same thing and I'm in a totally different state. It gives teachers the power to kind of pick and choose. I think of the old-fashioned, the choose your own adventure stories. Yes, I have to meet once a month for an hour virtually, but I can choose when it works for me to do the readings. I can choose when to try this stuff out. I have the coaching built into it, and it's a safe place to try out without the pressure of, okay, we did this full day PD, now my principal's coming in. And as researchers, how do we encourage this type of thing? How do we encourage a virtual, this safe space without always like, okay, but we have to get to fidelity. And so this is why we chose to do a virtual book and lesson study. So the book study was to look at instructional practices specific to the connection to evidence-based practices. So the first one, looking at vocabulary instruction. Purging, and purging comes from the book, but it's a very strong word. Rules that expire. And we know that rules that expire, if we teach those rules, it's often leading to misconceptions. And really thinking about utilizing learning tools, whether those are concrete manipulatives, There's a lot of virtual tools out there that teachers aren't often aware of that they can bring in even to an in-person classroom. How do we increase the higher level questions that lead to student discussions? We know discourse is important. It can't just be the teacher talking. So what kind of questions and activities do I need to do that lead to student engagement, that lead to student discussion? And of course, that often comes with those multiple representations. So we chose to do the book, The Math Pact by Sarah Bush, Karen Karp, and Barb Dougherty, because it aligned with our original plan for this math model demo that we, of course, had a pivot as a result of COVID. So our participants, we had 46 total educators across 3 cohorts. We started in the spring of 2021, and then we did a summer and a fall cohort. Our teaching experience really ranged, which is exciting. It wasn't just, oh my gosh, these are all kind of new green teachers. We had new teachers, but we also had teachers and coaches with a lot of experience. We also had a variety of grade spans. So you'll see 6th grade, 7th grade, teachers that taught 6th and 7th. We had a lot of rural teachers. As you'll see, about 72% of our population was from rural setting. And so they were often teaching 2 grade levels, or special educators that were across grade levels. And so that's where the grade 6th, 7th, and 8th comes in. And then of course, our setting, majority were rural, followed by the urban suburban. So again, a wide variety. One thing we didn't include, we had about 13 states, which is exciting. And you'll see this in the qualitative findings, that that's one thing the teachers like, it's not just my school, it's not just my state that are facing these challenges. So our procedures, as we mentioned, it was totally virtual. Each cohort ranged from 8 to 10 sessions. We actually had 10 in the spring, and the teachers were like, oh, it's a little too much. So we figured out how to cut it back a little bit. They're about 60 to 90 minutes. And the participants are responsible for, of course, attending and actively participating in the virtual sessions. And then between the virtual sessions, reading an assigned chapter, as well as sometimes an additional 1 or 2 articles. They also wrote 3 lessons and recorded themselves teaching 2 lessons and then coaching a peer. And we're going to talk about that coaching cycle in a second. Each session went through the required readings with a lot of questions. Think of it almost like a book club. And so this idea of, okay, let's discuss this, but then we also brought in math examples, meaning, yes, you're here, let's do some math problems. And we utilized Jamboard, and really it gave participants an opportunity to try different ways to solve problems, see how others solve problems, and talk through it and really model and practice. How do I increase discourse? These were adults that still needed that practice. And then of course, a lot of sharing from both the project team as well as teachers on different resources. All right, Pakethia, am I still going? Or am I handing this back to you?
You know, we can tag team this because
perfect.
we know we learn from one another, right? And so that's what the teachers in our book study did. Our greatest teachers are sometimes our colleagues. And so I think that really hits, that drives home what really happened during this book story, this book study, which was really underpinned by continuous improvement. And I know we think about, it's going to be on the next slide, that will of how this peer-to-peer collaboration actually had this built-in feedback. And oh, sorry, you went ahead for me, but it was a great way.
It makes sense.
Yeah. But I mean, it really does, you know, goes through the cycle of, often we're on our own, we lesson plan, we implement, but by recording those, they were able to partner with one another, review their own material, have someone else, another colleague, a peer, give them feedback and review their information in order to push one another and learn and share, discuss, and continue this whole feedback circle as they continue to work through the book and as they went through their lesson planning. Oh, Kat, did you want to? Okay.
Yeah, we already kind of talked about this, but as Pakethia already alluded to, they wrote 2 to 3 lessons independently, and they used we did a standard lesson plan just to have that consistency across, regardless of what school you were at. We used Go React, so they were able to record, coach right there. And this was the first time, I know as a teacher, I hate watching myself in recording, but it was that reflection piece to not only receive the coaching, but to watch themselves, like what worked well, what didn't work well, and have that peer feedback in almost real time. And here's our coaching cycle, very similar to what we talked about. So we had the lesson cycle, and then within that was the coaching. So we asked them to reflect to begin with, set a coaching goal, learn, that was our monthly PD sessions. And then they actually taught, observed one another, looked at that data piece, and I'm using data very loosely. We didn't ask for any student outcomes, but for them to really consider, were my students engaged? You know, what does in-class work look like? Reflect, and then start the process again. We did create a reflection rubric that they could review both their lessons as well as their actual teaching. All right, so that brings us to results and discussion.
And I'm looking at our time and I see that we're approaching towards the end, but we do want to highlight that there were some pre and post assessments where teachers were given a questionnaire in order to evaluate where they felt they stood when it came to implementing evidence-based practices, understanding their own perception of their own understanding, conceptual understanding, and also identify if they had any misconceptions with teaching as well. They were given that same, given another assessment at the end to see whether or not they had felt that their perception of their understanding of EBPs, conceptual understanding, had changed throughout that process as well through this feedback circle. And it's pretty surprising. And we have to remember that this is self-reported data. And so they are rating themselves. But from the beginning, a lot of the teachers that were a part of this book study really felt confident in their ability. And so they continue to rate themselves even higher from agree to strongly agree going through this process. And Kat, if there's anything you wanted to add, I don't know if we put in any of the if they rated their students in regards to their student
one
perception.
thing they said is that they felt like they were very high in their teaching, but that their students actually lacked a deep understanding of math. So that it was kind of a mismatch. So if you're teaching really well, are you saying your students are coming in low and you're not meeting their needs, or you're not meeting the needs? So just some lingering questions and things that make you kind of go, And then this was just the other piece. We asked them to do just 4 math problems to really look at specific. One, what is their conceptual understanding? Can they look at, ooh, that's a student error. What do I need to do next? And then again, I know we're looking at the time. You know, they asked as they were going through there at the beginning, there were a few spots, 3 participants that just, I have no clue how to solve this. I don't know what I should be looking for. In the post, they were able to solve those. Misconceptions, most in the pre were very kind of basic level, like, oh, they made a computational error. They should have used this formula. The post really had specific skills, like, oh, they need to address this prerequisite skills. So they're a little bit more rich in the knowledge of addressing those misconceptions. Social validity. This was one of our outcomes. We wanted people to go away from this book study like, oh, this was awesome. So you'll see 90% plus felt it was of high quality, very relevant, useful. And our satisfaction, one of our big questions, like, hey, how are you going to transfer this knowledge? How are you going to, do you plan on sharing? Do you want to help facilitate? Majority said yes. And you'll see in the qualitative findings that Pakethia will go over, they already started sharing while the book study was going on. All right, Pakethia.
Yes, and I think that's one of the important things to come out of this. Disseminating the information, continuing with the model of that peer-to-peer learning. And I know Kat talked about some of the misalignment between the teacher's understanding and yet that misalignment with students being able to understand. And I think that came out, especially towards the post-awareness piece, where even the teachers, their own vocabulary changed, and how they were explaining students answering and responding to questions, which shows that even though they may have rated themselves highly, that their own conceptual understanding developed. And so that's some of those qualitative pieces that were also brought up and also exhibited, as well as being able to use concrete manipulatives as well, in order to get students to that abstract thinking. And I think often that's something middle school teachers may think, oh, kids are too old for these, to use concrete materials. We have to do this abstract thinking, but really for them to come to this confidence of knowing that, hey, my students may need some of these scaffolds and supports in order to get them to where they need to be. And so that's this whole being mindful of their practices, of their instructional practices, which is one of those things that we really wanted teachers to be reflective on. Is there any other highlights that I may have forgotten?
I think just quite a bit. I know one teacher specifically, they have the Math Pack series as an elementary, middle, and high school focus, and they're planning on doing it with their entire district. And I think the other big piece, we had one person that was an instructional coach only, really bringing in these lessons and sharing pieces of this in her coaching. And then another teacher that was transitioning to a college professor who is planning on bringing these pieces into her pre-service work.
But we know that COVID had a big impact, and it actually caused the research project itself to pivot from more a schools being in schools to actually this national platform of doing a virtual book study. And so there were some barriers with sessions and being able to come together. However, those who continue to attend really found that the collaborative and the peer-to-peer sharing could take place virtually. And so that really helped them come to ways to build their own understanding. And also just that peer-to-peer learning really helped with sharing materials and resources that they would have otherwise would not have known about. And so that was a big aha when it came to there are lots of resources that can be embedded and used in order to support students.
All right. So very quickly, we keep talking about all this, but how do you do it? Guess what? We are going to have a book study module available for free. It's going to contain all the PowerPoints that a school research IHE professor can pick it up and use it. It'll be built in with Jamboard Jamboard will force you to make a copy, but it contains problems. So you could do it virtually or in person. We also are the lesson plans that the teachers wrote. So we have about 50 lessons written, taught, revised by middle school general and special educators, as well as a math coach. As I always joke, Pinterest, Teachers Pay Teachers, is not an evidence-based practice. These are lessons that contain evidence-based practices and were reviewed and revised based on a standard rubric. They're going to all be housed at the Center on Multi-Tiered System of Supports, and we will put the link in the chat, and you can also follow up with us. We also have some additional resources coming out of this model demo work, includes different professional development modules in the area of specially designed instruction. It's more than just a calculator. Increasing middle school engagement through high-level questioning and math tasks, and using multiple representations to increase conceptual understanding in middle school. So quite a bit of materials. Again, all will be housed for free on the Center for MTSS. And if you have any questions, we will be available in the chat. So go ahead and ask or reach out to us. You can reach me at Twitter at Dr. Gatto PF or at either one of our email addresses. Thank you, and we look forward to chatting in the future.
Yes, let's continue this conversation in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks.